Recapture, it's just a little announcement that, number one, it's an old integration, but we've moved it into our integration hub that you've seen earlier on in the day. If you're not familiar, it's a little bit of technology that protects your site from spam and abuse. So normally you'll see it being used on, if you're using it, your sign-in page for rate limiting, or maybe on some forms to prevent people from being able to spam you with loads of, say, feedback form responses. What we've done recently is added support for version 2 of Recapture. Previously it was version 1, and version 1 is due to shut down 31st of March 2018. So, a little bit of work to do if you're currently using it. This is what it looks like now. So it's that I'm not a robot box. If you're using it at the moment, you'll see the writing with some squiggly lines on it. That's gone. And the I'm not a robot box is turned up. So moving to version 2, your experience is going to vary depending on what you're using it for. If you're using just the out-of-the-box tools, all you need to do is patch with Continuum 70 or above, register for your Recapture version 2 API keys on Google, and then enable the version 2 in the integration hub page. And I'll show you a quick picture of that shortly. If you know that you're using it on any of your forms and you've had that custom enabled for you, you may need to talk to Spacecraft, or we can advise you on how you're going to have to update those in order to be prepared for version 2 to be deployed, so that you're ready for when version 1's turned off in March. So that's the page. It's really quick and easy. All you're going to need to do, if you're in this kind of easy path of using the core features, paste your keys in, change a little checkbox to version 2 from version 1, click save, and you're all good. Right, moving on. The joy of GDPR. Is anybody already prepared? Is anybody sorted? I can see some faces there laughing. Okay. Preparing for general data protection regulation. So it's an EU initiative, but we've got confirmation that regardless of our Brexit status, we're going to ratify this anyway, and it's going to be our own version, even if it's not the EU version. And to a certain extent, that doesn't matter because it covers EU citizens and their data, regardless of whether or not you're in the EU. So it's coming shortly. We've just had March 2018 for one thing being turned off. This is May 2018 that you need to get yourself ready, sorted to be compliant with GDPR. It's got a few kind of like the broad themes. We've got enhanced personal privacy rights. We've got an increased duty on yourselves and on ourselves to protect people's personal data. We've got mandatory breach reporting, and the thing that's really kind of like got people's attention is that there's now significant penalties for non-compliance. So it's, should really be on your radar because it's likely going to have a little bit of work to do. I've got a quick slide to summarise the key changes, but there's loads. So I'll come back to these as and when we hit them through our strategy for getting started, where we've broken this down into 4 steps to help you get to grips with what you need to deliver in order to be compliant. Now, you're likely all to have a data protection officer who's going to be managing this organisation-wide, but it's likely to also have some impact on yourselves to go and find data and also put data on your sites. So we've got 4 steps for getting to grips with this. Discovering where we've got our data, managing how we're going to access that data, protecting it, and then also this reporting section where you've now got to be able to demonstrate your compliance with GDPR. So, discover. Whoosh. We're looking for personal data, essentially, and what that is has changed slightly, I think, compared to the Data Protection Act. So we're looking for the kind of like the bog standard things, name, email address, but we might also be looking for, say, social media posts. We might be looking for, hopefully, I'm hoping my council doesn't have this, but any physiological or genetic information, medical information, but you might have, say, location, you might have IP addresses, you might have some information, say, on job application forms about cultural identity, and these are all things that we now need to classify locate in our databases and then make a note of. And in terms of where that information resides, we've obviously got standard things like emails, documents. We've got the database, notably the database of, say, your websites. We've also got, say, UAT sites where, to my knowledge, everybody's personal data is being stripped before it hits the UAT sites for any standard tables within the CMS and within X-Forms. But it's worth double checking now rather than waiting until May 2018. Log files and backups is another area where you need to be aware this data could be sat there and you might need to add in some additional policies, some additional procedures on how you're going to deal with it. So on our handy dandy form, we've got 2 boxes. One of them for what data we're collecting and one for what we're exporting and sharing. So collecting, it's not just, say, your user accounts. It could be your online forms, so people are submitting their data in your forms. It's a good idea at this point maybe to be auditing, or your DPO might have already started an audit of what information you're collecting in those forms. Job application forms, forms that you're linking to for other providers, like your housing benefits forms, if you've got any sort of online interface for those systems. And you've also got third-party integrations that could be sitting in the background. And these are also, way more important because there's a likelihood if they're SaaS products that they could be shipping the data across borders. So you could have personal data from your customers being stored in the US. And there's now that cross-border element is something that you really need to highlight in your privacy notices. In terms of data you share, you're probably going to be aware of these when you're kind of contacting, touching back office systems, that you're taking data from, say, accounts on your website, you're putting it into a CSV and then you're exporting it somewhere, and that's internally. You just need to be aware that that's additional processing. But if you're then sharing it with third-party organisations, if you've outsourced particular sections, that might be something that, you need to highlight on your privacy notice. Managing this data. So these are our new rights. We've got a right to be informed, right of access, right of rectification, right to erasure, so that's the be forgotten sort of elements. You've got a right to be able to restrict processing on data that you've submitted. The right to data portability, so to take all the data that you've personally provided, download that in an accessible form, and sometimes that can also be data that's then being processed. So if there's some debate at the moment, the way that they're looking at it is if you, say, gone to a price comparison site and it's taken all your data, put it into a nice, easy to process configuration, that they'll want to be able to download that so that they can pop it on somebody else's site. So it might be information that they didn't directly provide you, but that you've worked out on your own. They've got a right to object to any processing, and they've also got a right to be subject to, not to be subject to any automated decision making. I don't think that one's going to affect anybody in this room, but you never know. Worth being aware of in case you're looking at maybe procuring any third-party software that bolts onto your website and uses any of your account data. So the things here, in terms of managing this, the things that you need to be aware of is how you're going to cover this in terms of internal policies and any procedures that you need to have, particularly around kind of process maps on your website, like process maps of how people are going to interact with these rights, trigger requests here, whether you're going to need to then process that information and pass it out to other areas of your business. Things like, how do you process a request to delete somebody's personal data? How are you going to take that from maybe being a form that they're submitting online to actually getting rid of that data and confirming to them that it's gone? Are you able to, say, provide people's data where they're invoking this right of data portability? Because it might be that, say, they've asked for, I can't imagine why they would do this, but I'm sure someone will find a reason, all the form responses that they've ever given you. How are you going to provide that in this portable format? How would you manage a correction to data that you hold if you're then pushing it out to third parties? How are you going to allow them access to personal data that you're collecting? Especially, There's the direct stuff. There's things like if you're using our account functionality, they're going to have their own My Account page. They're going to be able to self-service and go and get that information themselves, see what forms they've submitted. But if you say using maybe a third-party forms solution that doesn't bolt in as well, maybe that's an area you need to look at and just audit and be aware of these problems before your data protection officer maybe comes to you to say that there's a problem. It's areas where you can be prepared. There's a new element around consent, and I'm going to come back to it in a minute, but you need to be able to record consent for that data to be processed. And there's now a requirement in some cases to be able to verify people's age, so that, you know, in the off chance that a young child decided to request a Miss Bin's collection, that you could account for them being a small child and therefore get consent from their parents. I don't think that would come up. You never know. So consent. This new idea, well, it's not a new idea, but consent's changed a bit. It used to be okay that you could maybe imply consent by the fact that you're already using the website, it's in our terms and conditions, we've pre-checked it and you're fine. Not so much now. So it needs to be prominent. It can't be in the terms and conditions. It can't be a pre-checked box. You need to explain in clear, plain language what you're going to do with the data, especially if you're transferring it, say, out of the country, if you're going to be doing any additional processing on it, for sharing it with a third party, for, say, advertisements and that sort of interaction. You need to be explaining why you want that data and what you're going to do with it. And you need to be granular in terms of giving them the possibility of only consenting to particular parts of this process. You need to name the organisations, tell them how they can withdraw their consent, and ensure that they can refuse to consent without detriment to themselves. So it's a tricky area, and a lot of it kind of feeds into the privacy notice. So when you're collecting data, they need to be able to see the privacy notice, which I think this is already part of DPA. The current Data Protection Act, if you're in complete compliance, a lot of this should already be easy for you to just extend a little bit. So in your privacy notice, I've got a checklist on the box, I forgot. So we've got a checklist for processes and policies on the different new rights. We've got a checklist for our consent. We've also got a checklist for our privacy notice in terms of providing contact details for your control and your DPO. The purpose and your lawful basis for processing the data. So you might have a statutory responsibility to go and collect some of this data given the area that you're in, but you might also be basing your lawful basis for collecting the data on their consent, and that's the sort of area where you need to be highlighting it. Who the data shared with, transfers to other countries. I'm just going to whiz through this bit. How long you're going to keep the data needs to be in your privacy policy. The rights of the data subject, so those rights that we dealt with a couple of slides ago, these need to be highlighted so they know that they can say withdraw their consent in your privacy notice. The individuals have the right to complain and withdraw consent. Consequences of failing to provide the personal data, so that's the can refuse consent without detriment kind of coming back, that they know what the consequences are if they don't want to provide this to you. And again, it's easy and clear language. It can't be kind of like legalese, really dense. It needs to be kind of very easy for them to be able to understand. So, protect, and this is where I can give you some information too. Ooh. Protecting data. So we need to be able to prove that we're protecting it. We need a log to show that we are protecting it. So areas that you might want to look at doing is auditing who has access to personal data. So in your website, in your Jadu control center, if you're using, say, our account section, you might want to audit who of your web admins has access to the marketing module and the users section, because they can go in and check anybody's personal details. You might want to audit who has access to the submitted form section or job application sections, just to double check that those people, say, haven't moved role within your organisation, whether they still need those rights to be able to go and check up whoever's postcode, personal details, their particular submissions. You need to, so that should be happening regularly. And you also need to be looking at, if you're not already doing it, and I believe most people are, regular pen tests, testing your own security regularly to make sure that you can prove you've taken every possible step to protect people's data and to prevent breaches. So this is one of a bit. So as part of procurement now under GDPR, you're going to be expected to do data protection impact assessments, which are fun. I would expect this to be handled entirely by your data protection officer, but maybe it's something to be aware of, that there's this new step when you're looking at purchasing something, some service that's going to interact with your users' personal details. There's this new step where you need to have actually done an impact assessment to see what risks are there around this particular service, people's data going missing, moving across borders. One of the sections, big section in terms of personal data and security, is encryption. So I've summarised, if you need it, for future reference, the particular encryption algorithms that we're using within the CMS. And I've managed, we've got form responses, so Xforms Pro is storing user submissions using the AES algorithm, user details are stored triple DES, and we've got passwords which are secured using the bcrypt password hashing function. But you need to check that if you've got any custom developments, or if you're using any third-party things, or if you've developed anything in-house, that data's been held in an encrypted form, that you know what algorithm's been used to encrypt it, that you're confident, or that you've, as an organisation, are confident that you've taken the best steps you can to put it in an encrypted form that's sufficient these days, because a number of them have kind of fallen by the wayside, and old ones which would have been acceptable maybe 5 years ago are no longer acceptable. So what algorithm are you using, what you're storing, where's it stored? We've got a little box for you to record what encrypted data you've got, and usually it's going to be things like people's user details, people's form details. Move on. Data breaches are a section where the regulations have really changed. So you need to be able to show these days that you can detect a breach if it happens. You need to consider how you'd then report that breach, and you need to have the procedures in place to be able to investigate it. Now, it might be that you are not personally responsible for investigating these things, but it would be a good idea at this point to determine, between your suppliers, who is going to take on all these different sections. We've got different areas of data breach as well, because we've got the kind of like the physical security elements, people getting into networks, people being able to get access to storage, but we've also got things like your identity management and how you are checking that this particular user account belongs to this person, and that only they should have access to that particular information, and that this person who's just tried to gain access by asking the password to be reset over the telephone, actually, are they the same person, and should you be doing it? And we've got forgot password and other sections, other functionality within the software to manage that, where we're checking for access to, say, an email address, but it is possible to manually do it over the phone, by accessing the control centre, and even if it's just letting people know not to be able to do that anymore, it'd be useful. Let's move on to our reporting section. See if we can quicken up a bit. Record keeping. So again, new responsibility. It's not so much, and I would expect this again to fall to your DPR, you should be fine. It's not so much that you have to do it, you now need to be able to prove that you're in compliance as well, should anybody make a complaint. So you're going to need a register as an organisation of what personal data you're holding, where it's kept, what classification of data it is, what third parties have access to that data, whether it's crossing borders, being shipped off to the US, what purpose of processing any data, what's the purpose if you actually do process data, and what security measures you've got in place to protect it. You might also want to jot down how long you're going to keep it for, so that people have this right to be forgotten. And it is something where you might need to make these records available to a supervisory authority at some point if you do get a complaint against you. So, quick summary. Got a little checklist for your record keeping, and we've got places where you can note, say, your last content, your last access audit, your last pen test. And that's all in response to the GDPR is coming in May 2018. There is no getting away from it, it's coming. And it includes these increased rights for individuals. It includes these increased responsibilities for you to keep records. And really, from your point of view, the areas that you're probably going to look at is what forms do you need to provide? Is your privacy notice up to date? Is it visible in every place where you're collecting data? Are you asking for consent to process data in a way that is now acceptable? Have you checked that the security activities that you're responsible for putting in place are going to give you sufficient coverage to ensure that you meet compliance? And then set up processes to handle these new rights. If you do all that, you should be fine. Easy, right?